get us all set up. I think we're ready to go now. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Lindsay Marsh. I am our Senior Associate on Census Engagement. We realized a couple weeks ago that we haven't talked to the entire network lately about the census. There's been a lot of other stuff going on, but the census is still happening, and it's still really, really, really important for our community. So we wanted to bring everyone in today to give a brief update. I do have a couple of slides for those of you who haven't been in any of our other presentations about the census. So if you're new to the census, we wanted to bring you up to speed a little bit, and we have some more resources for you to catch up to speed. But then we wanted to talk about the current state of the census and where we're going to be going in the next few months. So we're going to do that basic recap. I'm going to talk about how the census has changed in the last 5 months, because it has been 5 months since we started doing this all from home. What the challenges are, what's happening in the news right now, because I think that's a really important piece for us to know on the ground, and then how we're going to handle the next 3 months, because the census won't be over for a little bit longer. I'm going to wrap up with talking a little bit about civic engagement, because the census ties into civic engagement and civic engagement activities that the network can partake with, and then we'll do questions. So if we go the full hour, we'll go the full hour. If not, I'll give you 15 minutes back of your day. Let's get started. And let's see if I can turn my sound, maybe. Okay. Oh, no, not that one. Trying to do things with my computer that I shouldn't be doing. All right, so the census started in 1790. We've been doing this for over 200 years at this point. This is something that our founding fathers developed as a way to make sure that resources and war debt were safe, fairly allocated throughout the state. So every 10 years, we do this count. We count every person who lives in the United States. Article 1, Section 2 is where you can find this in the Constitution. We have since amended it in 1868. We've tweaked some of this just a little bit to make it more inclusive and less racist, frankly. The 3/5 compromise, from those of you who can remember that far back into high school and middle school, was eradicated by the language adjustment in 1868. But the Constitution mandates that we count every person who lives in our country every 10 years. So that's what we're doing here in 2020. And when I say we count everyone who lives here I mean everyone. So if you lived in the United States on April 1st, 2020, you get counted in the census. This includes people who are undocumented immigrants. This includes diplomats. This includes foreign au pair students who are foreign exchange students and au pairs, two different things, but includes both of them. If you lived in the United States on April 1st, you get counted in our 2020 census. The census is 10 simple, basic demographic questions. So if you help customers with their LIHEAP form, that LIHEAP form asks far more invasive questions than the census does. It'll ask you name, date of birth, age, sex. It'll ask what race you consider yourself, and you can put multiple answers. It'll ask what countries of origin you have. So if you, like me, I'm white, and my ancestors are from England and Germany. So I put that I was white, and then I marked England and Germany as my countries of origin. Those questions are simply because the Census Bureau is trying to figure out a little bit more in-depth information about who makes up our country. It's got nothing to do with segregating people or gerrymandering districts, which we'll talk about in a minute, to exclude different races from different places. In fact, the Census Bureau can't share that demographic information like that with other entities from the government or with local officials. So it's just 10 simple demographic questions, and it's nothing that the people we work with daily aren't used to talking about and filling out in forms anyway. The results of the census are used to allocate federal dollars, which fund our programs at community action agencies across the country, and political power. And that's something that's become far more important since the Black Lives Matter movement began at the end of May and in early June. We need to strongly encourage our communities of color to fill out the census. It's one thing to be involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, which so many people are these days, but a lot of them don't realize that the basic building block of democracy is the census. So if you aren't counted in the census, you are literally giving away your political power. So if you care about the Black Lives Matter movement and equality in this country, you need to fill out your census form. And finally, the census, as a recap, it's safe, easy, and important. The Census Bureau has three main protections to keep your information safe. The first one, as I earlier mentioned, the census is not allowed to give any information that they collect about a person or an individual to any entity in the government. So they cannot share data with ICE or Homeland Security or HUD. If you have a Section 8 housing voucher and you have one extra person in your house than you're supposed to, and you fill it out, you're afraid to fill your form out fully and correctly because of that person, you shouldn't have that fear. The HUD will never find out that you have that extra person. Your landlord will never find out. Well, they will, but in 72 years. So the second protection is that these forms are kept confidential and under wraps for 72 years. And so to put that in perspective, in 2022, 2 years from now, the forms that were sent out and filled out in 1950 will be released to the general public. So my grandfather filled out the form for my mom and my grandmother and my aunt and my uncle in 1950. My grandfather, first of all, passed away 20 years ago. Second of all, any landlord that he would have had in 1950 would also now be deceased. So there's a protection there that this information does come out, which is really cool for people who do genealogy research, but it's not something that will impact you in any way, shape, or form. So the first protection is that the Census Bureau cannot share any private information with any other government entity. The second protection, they keep these things under wraps for 72 years. And the third protection is something called Title 13, where Census Bureau employees pledge an oath to this Title 13 that says they will not reveal personal private information that they learn on the job by working with customers or through handling data at all. They're pledging confidentiality, not just for the time where they work for the Census Bureau, but for life. So if they find out that somebody has an undocumented immigrant in their household throughout the course of working with census data, and they reveal that information to ICE, for example, and that person gets deported because of that, that Census Bureau employee can go to jail for up to 5 years and be possibly fined $250,000. No one has ever been charged with that because it's such a strict policy and it's such a real threat that no one has ever had to go to. It has never been brought up as a challenge. So it works, is my point. Anyone else feel like it's like the 15th day of the week? It's been a real doozy for us all. All right, let's move on to the next slide and talk about COVID changes. So there are a lot more basics about the census. So if you're just coming to this project, I didn't want to waste a lot of time, but we have a couple of videos where I talk through a lot more of the basics that Lauren can pop into the chat. So you can follow up with that or reach out to me. I'm happy to talk about the census whenever. So let's talk about how the census has been changed in the last 5 months. The census technically started on January 21st in a small little remote village in Alaska, where they kick off the census every 10 years. That's been the norm the past several cycles. And they do it because this is when the hunters and gatherers are wintered. They have sheltered in place for the winter, and they can actually do the census up there. It's also when everything has frozen over, and so you can get a ski mobile up there. So that's when the census started. That was normal. Mid-March is when all the census forms started hitting mailboxes across the country. And the original self-response period, where we encourage people to go online, fill out the forms, over the phone, or to fill out the mailed forms that are that are sent to folks. The planned period for that was supposed to be mid-March to May. They sent several postcards, they sent the forms, they sent invitations in Spanish and English to some places, and all of these materials pushed people to the phone lines, which is a new method to complete the census this cycle, to go online, which is www.my2020census.gov, which is also a new format to fill out the census, or to use the paper forms that are traditional that were also sent out. That has been pushed back. You could always fill out the census until the last day, which was supposed to be tomorrow, but the self-response push period was supposed to be March to May. Now we're pushing folks to self-respond through Halloween. So the Census Bureau has requested additional time to collect those data responses and do the data crunching on the back end due to COVID. Non-response follow-up. This is where Census Bureau employees go door to door. So the goal was to encourage people to self-respond between March and May, and then in May to knock the doors that haven't yet responded, fill out the survey face-to-face at the door. That was scrapped because of COVID, completely scrapped. So we pushed it, and now that period is supposed to start in August. So it's supposed to start sometime around August 8th. There are some areas where they've done what's called a soft launch, and so there have been non-response follow-up operations, which means Census Bureau employees at the door. They're called enumerators. Enumerators have been knocking doors in some areas, but it'll be nationwide, except for extreme COVID hotspots throughout the country starting in August 8th. That's actually an opportunity for us. I think that many of you have probably seen the graphics that Lauren put together about how to identify a Census Bureau employee at your door. There are 5 main ways. They come between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. They will be wearing a badge. They will be carrying an iPhone. They will have official logo markings on their car if they have a car. They will have a census bag, if I didn't mention that, and they will have a mask. So all census employees, if they are doing door-to-door knocking, will be conscientious of social distancing and of basic hygiene and masks, sanitation, hand sanitation, and the like, to make people more comfortable and to protect our Census Bureau workers. So we're using this opportunity to push folks to know that if they don't fill out this form by themselves, then they're going to have to talk to somebody who comes to their door to fill it out. And Census Bureau employees will knock on doors up to 6 times. I've heard that they might be also doing phone calls, which would be really wise, in fact. But I haven't heard details on that. So if I find that out, I will send that around. But that's a big change. It's a big change to the methodology that these folks will be knocking doors, and to the procedures that are in place for it. Plus, it's starting, 3 months late? March, May, April, June, right? So can't even do the numbers. It's been a week. May, June, July. So it's starting 3 months late. And it's supposed to go through Halloween. So when the Census Bureau requested additional time from Congress, they mean for the data crunching. So they extended the deadlines for accumulating the data for doing these responses from households. They extended their deadline to Halloween, which they can do themselves. What they need permission from Congress is to deliver the materials, the numbers, the raw data that they've crunched into apportionment numbers and redistricting numbers late. So apportionment means how many seats in Congress, how many congressional representatives each state will get based on these congressional numbers. So we count everybody, we divide that number by 435, which is the number of seats we have in Congress, and then we apportion each state with the number of representatives they have based on population. We think that the new number will be about 810,000, 820,000 people per congressional seat. So if you have a little bit over 1.6 million people in your state, you'll get 2 congressional seats. Some states, Vermont, Delaware, Montana, Wyoming, I want to say at least one, if not both of the Dakotas, automatically get 1 state seat apportioned to them just because they're a state, even though their population doesn't reach that threshold. But everyone else is apportioned based on population. Those numbers are important because it'll show it'll determine the control of Congress based on political party in a lot of ways. So if Democratic parts of Texas get more seats than Republican parts of Texas, or say Oklahoma, then Congress will be reflected in that. So it's a partisan issue at the end of the day. Redistricting numbers are supposed to come out in April, and the Census Bureau has requested an extension until the end of July. Those redistricting numbers show where the populations are within those states. So all of the states can then go through and adjust their boundary lines. So if you have 10 congressional districts now and you add 820,000 people to your population and you gain a seat, you need to figure out where that 11th district sits. So you move all the other lines to create an 11th district in your state. So those redistricting numbers are really important as well. If some of you have heard the term gerrymandering, redistricting process of gerrymandering is where you draw those boundary lines to benefit one political party or another, which is why you sometimes see some very funny congressional districts that have long fingers that make no geographic sense to the map, but they do that to carve out pockets of Republicans or Democrats to make a seat one or the other. Thank you for popping that into the chat, Lauren. I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges that we're facing. So clearly, COVID is a big deal, but there are lots of trickle-down things and snowballs that we've seen from this. The first problem is that a lot of the offices for the Census Bureau were shuttered for months. They had a goal of opening up all of their offices by June 1st, back in May. And for the most part, they managed to do that. They wanted to get them up to what's called peak operation, which means that those offices were humming along, fully staffed, people were trained and ready to go. The Black Lives Matter protests shut some of those offices back down, but it was an isolated thing, and I believe that they're all up and functional now. Regardless, though, that set people back with their planning and their training. They've moved most of their training online, which is good, but they still need to come in. Census Bureau enumerators and operations folks that are being hired and brought on right now have to come in and pick up a laptop, but then they can do most of their training online, which has been a really good development. That being said, census hiring has been difficult because people who are typical Census Bureau enumerators tend to be retirees. They tend to be older folks who have been around for a while, who come back year after year to do this work. They tend to be teachers who have summers off. So the hiring process has been a little funky because starting 2 months late, you've got people who were available for May, June, July, who might not be available for August, September, and November, not September, October. Seriously, having trouble today. I hope that people find that amusing. The other problem with Census Bureau hiring right now is that they've seen an attrition rate of about 50%. So people who thought that this was a good idea, who maybe got laid off from their normal job because of COVID, who thought this would be a good way to add work to their plate, but are now afraid of COVID. And so we've seen about a 50% attrition rate due to that. So they're still hiring people, they're still trying to train people, they're still trying to get people out in the field, but they're struggling, which is an issue. Public trust erosion. We see people not willing to open their doors to anybody right now. That ties in with COVID fear, but we're also seeing a lot of things in the news that I'm going to talk about on the next slide that's scaring people away from filling out the census forms. They don't trust the process. They also think that the process has ended. A lot of people think that Census Day was April 1st and that they missed the boat if they didn't fill out their forms. And so there's nothing they can do about it. They don't recognize that the census goes, or they don't know that the census goes until now Halloween, and they can still fill out the form. But when they do, they think about who lived in their house on Census Day. Like, that's why that April 1st date is important. But if you remember, forms started being sent on March 12th, and you could have started filling out your census form on March 12th, thinking about who was going to live in your house on April 1st. That time elapsing issue is real. We really want people to fill the forms out as soon as they possibly can, because we know that the farther we get away from April 1st, the more memory fades. I can barely remember, I think it's Thursday, but I can barely remember what day it is right now because things are crazy. There's a lot of stress because of COVID. There's a lot of turmoil in the world right now. There's just a lot going on top of normal. So remembering back to what you were doing and who lived in your house on April 1st, the farther we get away from that deadline, the harder it is to remember, and the accuracy of our data erodes a little bit. We are going to talk about political turmoil. I think I've touched on all these things, so we're just going to move to the next slide. So the census has been in the news a lot. We started last year with the roadblock of a potential citizenship question. The Supreme Court struck down the citizenship question idea in June, and it was confirmed in July when the Trump administration dropped the question. But even just the fact that it was in the news really struck people, and it has stuck with people. There is we have a lot of data now on who has filled out the census and who hasn't filled out the census. And folks can go to the CUNY hard to count maps to see some geographic representations of who has completed the census forms and who hasn't in your area. I'm a data nerd and I find it a lot of fun to play with. But from those reports and from the numbers the Census Bureau has sent us, we know that it's largely communities of color that have not responded yet to the census forms. We also know that it's people who live in poverty. We know that it's people who move frequently. College students that's a difficult demographic as well. There are lots of different pockets, but we know that overwhelmingly children are getting left behind right now, as are communities of color, and so especially children of color. And we know part of that is because the citizenship question was in the news last year. The last 2 weeks, we've seen a lot more news about the census. I think it was last Monday, it may have been last Tuesday, but it was sometime last week. It was at the 20th, around the 20th of July. Trump issued a memorandum, not an executive order, but a memorandum where he's essentially trying to tell the Census Bureau that they can only use citizens when they do the redistricting numbers and the apportionment numbers. This is the whole point of the citizenship question. It makes the census blatantly partisan, which as a nonpartisan entity, the Community Action Partnership is totally against. We need this to be an inclusive, fair count process. So we disagree with anybody making the census a political football. The memorandum is trying to convince the Census Bureau to not include people who lived in this country on April 1st, because it will sway the counts in favor of a political party. It is unconstitutional, and it will not stand. Our partners at our Census Counts Coalition, places like the ACLU, we have a wide variety of organizations that are challenging this in court already. The problem is that this gets into the news, and so people hear this. They don't know what it actually says. They just hear Trump and citizenship and census, and they assume that that means that if they fill out the form, they're at risk for being deported or get into some kind of trouble if they are an undocumented person who lives in this country, or even a legal immigrant, frankly, who lives in this country. The fact is that the census still does not ask a citizenship question, and it cannot, and it will not. We're also about 63% of households have responded in this country. We can't go back and ask an additional question or anything like that for those 63%. So in some ways, it's a non-starter as an issue, except that we know that it's going to fearmonger for our communities. So that's happening, and that is in the news. The other thing that's going on is that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has requested $1 billion for the census, which at first blush sounds really great. We could really use that money for the Census Bureau to increase their operations and do more media buys, more outreach, hire more people to phone bank, or whatever the case may be. We would love that. However, there's a nefarious purpose behind this request. In conjunction with that request, Mitch McConnell is also trying to claw back that's not fair. He's trying to shorten time period that the Census Bureau has to complete their work. So instead of having that extension through Halloween, he's saying, we'll throw $1 billion at the census, but we want you to stick to the original deadlines. And at this point in the process, because we've now been all working under the idea that the census collection period ends on Halloween, it would be impossible to have a fair and complete count if that were to happen. So $1 billion is great, but based on the challenges that we're facing with hiring folks, training folks, getting them out in the field, people being afraid to open their doors because they don't want to get COVID-19 from somebody who is literally walking door to door, all of those things combined means that there's no way, even with $1 billion, the Census Bureau can be completed in a complete, fair, accurate, counted way between now and the original deadline. Then the third thing that's been in the news that Mitch McConnell supports is the Census Bureau is trying to claw back, that's where that word comes from, claw back their extension request. So now they're trying to say, I know we asked for this extra time to do this, but we don't really need it. We want to withdraw that request, which they can't really do. But again, it's in the news, and it's all trying to mess with the Census Bureau and their operations to make the count not fair. And all of these things are things that we have to contend with because our customers hear these things on the ground. They hear the news, they don't know what it means. And so if we're trying to talk to them about how the census is really important for them to fill out and to participate in, when they hear this stuff in the news, we need to make sure we can counter those things. If anyone did not get the email that I sent out last week addressing Trump's memorandum, the Senate funding request, and the Census Bureau's extension request, please send your email address to Lauren and we can send that out to you. Just pop it in the DMs for her to collect. We sent that out through our Google group. So I guess if you're not on our Google group, you didn't get it. The Google group is something that we use to send out more frequent notices and information than we can through our mail client, Constant Contact. So we send out a newsletter every 2 weeks about the census, but we want to make that the most important stuff, the readily available things, the 1, 2, 3 of what is important for the census for the next 2 weeks. And the Google group allows us to do a lot more lifting of our coalition partners' campaigns, sending out graphics a lot more often, and events and activities that are happening. So that's what the difference between those two things are and why you may not have gotten that. So as the partnership continues this project, because the census is still happening, we have a plan for the next 3 months. We actually have 2 plans. We are currently in our Census Summer campaign. So this is linked to the toolkit, which we can also pop in the chat. But we put together graphics and we put together a calendar so people can share different pieces of information about the census to keep it fresh. So one thing we recognize is that the census continues to drag on, frankly. We know that we need to keep things fresh for folks, and so we're trying to give you new graphics. We are supplementing that with coalition campaigns. Like this week, we had the True For You campaign and Day of Action on Tuesday, where we're trying to convince people to fill out the census forms now through self-response on the phones or over the internet to prevent somebody from having to come to their door next week. So that's what's going on. We're also talking about NRFU, which is non-response follow-up. So the graphics that Lauren posted in the chat about how to identify a census worker. It's important information for people to have, but it also hopefully will encourage them to ask the question, why are people coming to my door and what can I do to prevent that? and then we can push them to filling out the census forms online or over the phone, or they can find the mailings from March and April that have the physical paper copy that they can fill out. We are currently planning a fall campaign that'll start after our annual convention. If you haven't signed up for our virtual conference yet, you should. I'm excited about a lot of the panels, not just the census ones that we've got going on. So you should look into that. But we also decided people were going to be busy through Labor Day. So we will kick off the week of Labor Day with a new campaign that will talk about how to self-respond and how to handle folks at your door, all those kinds of things. That'll take us through to Halloween. A last chance, it's not too late, you still count, that kind of an idea. And we will have the toolkit with the graphics and a calendar and sample text for all of that as well. And all of this is punctuated with what our coalition members are doing as well. I did just find out that next week the Census Bureau is doing a rural outreach week, and so we'll do something for that as well to help folks engage on a rural level, because we know that that's another difficult target demographic for us. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, so I've done that, but we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about civic engagement and how census ties into the civic engagement work that Ryan Gelman, our Senior Associate for Public Policy, and I have been working on doing. The first step in civic engagement is being counted, and there are two reasons why being counted in the census is important for community action. Great. First of all, the federal funding that ties into our programs, ties into Head Start, ties into LIHEAP funding. So many of the formulas that we use to get our funding on the local level comes through census counts. So those numbers literally get plugged right in. Also, community needs assessments that we do every 3 years at every agency, you're using census numbers. So we need to make sure that those are the most accurate they can be in our community. So we're planning the next 3 years of our agency programs based on the right numbers. And political representation. All of this is really, really important, but it's also the idea that our customers count. So many of our folks are told that they don't count. They live in poverty. They get handouts. There are lots of negative things that are thrown at the populations we work with. And if we can convince them that they count, we give them a little self-esteem boost. And it might seem insignificant, but over time, being told you're worth something really matters. So there's twofold for census. But then we move into voter registration and mobilization. I've got a couple of slides that talk about this. We did a fabulous webinar. It is 90 minutes, but it's worth it. A couple of weeks ago with CAPLA and the Coalition on Human Needs. And CAPLA talked through what we can do with agencies that are both C3 and CSBG funded. The bottom line is that we can do a lot of things to encourage people to register to vote. We simply cannot do it with CSBG dollars. I am not CSBG funded. My project is funded by a private grant, so I can say whatever I want to about voter registration and mobilization as long as it is nonpartisan. So we will be doing a lot of this work as well in conjunction with census throughout the fall. We will provide folks with graphics about voter registration and when to request your absentee ballot and how to make sure that you have voter protection rights in the palm of your hand, literally. We'll be doing palm cards that say things like, if you get into line to vote and the polling place is closed, you have every right to stay in line if you were in line before they close at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or whatever it is until you can vote. So stay in line if you get there with voter protection hotlines and all those kinds of things. So people have a physical something in their hand that they can take to the polls that day. We are encouraging everyone to vote by mail this year that can. We are voting, so vote by mail and absentee ballots are the same thing. There's a lot of confusion right now out in the public about that, but they're the same thing. We want people to request those absentee ballots and those mail-in ballots if your state allows you to, because we want you to vote and we want you to vote early. We are expecting that this election will be very contentious and very difficult. COVID is going to impact the polls. We won't have poll workers like we normally do. We're expecting that voter purges are going to be a thing where people think they're registered, but their state had an aggressive voter purge, and turns out you're not because you were eliminated from the voter rolls. So we encourage people to go to www.rockthevote.org to check your voter registration, to make sure you're registered, you're up to date on your registration, to eliminate any reason why any one of us, staff members or customers, would be denied the right to vote. And if that does happen, you also have the right to vote in a provisional ballot. So these are things we're going to be talking about with the network a lot, and we're going to post graphics that you can share. Facebook is a free platform, so as long as somebody doing the posting is using their non-CSBG funded time, you can share all of our graphics without worrying about running afoul of the laws that govern our agencies. Lauren, can you share the webinar from CapLaw in the chat just so people know where that is? I think it's also posted on our website. I'm sure that's the link she'll give you. 90 minutes worth it, definitely worth it. So we'll be doing work with that. Redistricting is next, and we will be doing a campaign about that. Some states can impact redistricting and some can't. So again, that's where states redraw their boundaries based on the new Census Bureau counts to draw their congressional districts. Also, their state house districts, their state representative and Senate districts, voting districts, school districts. All of these things come down to census counts. So there are some states where we will be able to do monitoring and maybe influence those redistricting lines being drawn because the state house does those. Some places have, every state does it differently, but there are some states where we can have an impact, and we'll be talking about that. And then finally, Ryan, I would probably be disappointed if I didn't make a plug for advocacy. We can't really lobby. That's not our job. Any one of us can lobby individually. So if you want to go and talk to your state representatives or your House members or your senators about Mitch McConnell trying to sneak in all of this additional funding and taking away the timing, you can do that on your own. That's considered lobbying, and you can do that as an individual for sure. Our agencies can't do that. But what we can do is called advocacy, which is making sure that our state representatives and our state senators and our House and congressional and Senate for federal offices know who we are and what we do. So we can make appointments with our elected officials and say, this is who we are as Community Action. This is what we do for the community. We hope that you'll remember us when you pass legislation. That is completely permissible. And the webinar that Lauren popped in the chat addresses a lot of that as well. I wanted to have these slides in there. If you don't have time to go through the entire CapLaw PowerPoint, and webinar, you can look at this. We can do these activities again with non-CSBG funded personnel. We cannot be partisan about it. We cannot promote one candidate over another. We cannot tell people that they should register as a Republican or as a Democrat or as a Green Party or Libertarian. You just push everybody to register to vote. That is all we can do. We have to be even-handed about it. You can invite candidates to do a forum, but you have to invite all of them. If they don't all accept, that's not on you. You've done your due diligence. But if you want to invite somebody to talk about their campaigns, you have to invite the full slate of candidates. Agencies cannot volunteer time as a group to a candidate. You cannot give money to a candidate. You cannot use Head Start funds or staff during work hours for voter registration, but Head Start can invite a third-party entity that is nonpartisan to come to a Head Start facility to register people to vote. So Head Start facilities can invite Rock the Vote or League of Women Voters to come onto their premises to do a voter registration drive if you have those activities happening during COVID. Looks like a shorter list, but it's really not. We can and should encourage people to vote and to register to vote, to update their registrations and take the steps they need to be engaged this fall. We can encourage people to vote on election day early or by mail. We can tell people what election information is required. So there are some states, Alabama comes to mind, where in order to cast an absentee ballot, you must include a photocopy of your ID. A lot of our customers might not have an ID or might not have access to a photocopy machine, but they can certainly ask somebody in an agency, hey, can you photocopy my license for me, without knowing what it's for, that they can then include in their absentee ballot return. But if they don't know they need it, then they might not know to ask for it. So that's something that we can do in a nonpartisan manner to help our customers vote. We can refer customers to nonpartisan groups and government offices to vote, your Secretary of State. And again, Rock the Vote has links for all of these states by state. And it's a great resource to start. And we can allow nonpartisan organizations to vote, register voters at Head Start facilities. We are doing a webinar series on civic engagement. The next one is about advocation, not sure that's a word, advocating for your community. And Ryan Gelman will be talking about the differences between advocacy and lobbying and how we can do this work to help forward the missions of our agencies. I will be talking about census and redistricting a lot more in depth at the end of September. And then in October, Ryan and I will go through a history of the issues that we've seen in elections past, and we'll really be pushing that election protection and the rules and regulations, like if you're in line before the polls close, you have every legal right to stay in line and cast your ballot, even if the polls have closed. Things like that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about John Lewis and the amazing work that he has done to win the right to vote for marginalized communities, specifically communities of color in our country. So it'll be part history and part advocacy on voting. We encourage people to join us for all of those webinars, and we will be putting out a series of materials. This is the first one. We're currently putting resources on the back of this, and we will have that available, just like we have census materials available for free, which means coloring pages, buttons, stickers, fact sheets, palm cards that all talk about the census and how people can complete their census forms. We will have voter registration and civic engagement pamphlets and packages available as well. We're working on those now. We should have those out by convention that people can order. I mentioned our new Civic Engagement Google group earlier today. Again, if you are not a part of that and would like to be, to get more in-depth information on actions that you can share with your agencies and customers, send your email address to Lauren in the chat. You can join our Facebook group, which is strictly community action people. You cannot be a part of that group and not be connected to civic community action. And we share resources, we talk about things people are doing. We encourage you to do that. We have a census newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We post all of our graphics ourselves, so you can share from there if you follow us. Census resources, and this is our staff list. I think then, yeah, we're ready for questions if we have any. I know I just went through a lot of material. I'm going to leave this up because if you have a specific question that I don't have time to answer today, you can certainly reach out to any of us through email. So with that being said, I'm not sure if we told people to send chat to us about questions. I don't know if we have anything in the queue. It doesn't look like it, but I'll hang out for a couple minutes if anyone, and Lauren, is there anything that I need to clarify that I totally befuddled you with on that? That was a lot of information.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right, well, I will hang out for a little bit, but those of you who don't have questions and want to drop off, I will give you 15 minutes back of your day. I want to thank everybody for joining us and listening to me yammer about the census and civic engagement. I do welcome questions, so please do shoot me an email if there's something I can do to help with.